Well, welcome everyone to today's 25-minute ILTA YouTube video entitled, we're taking a breath, Lost in Translation, Understanding Generational Communication in a World of BRB, FOMO, IRL, and PPL. I'm your moderator, Glenn Hoxie, Senior Project Manager at Paul Hastings in the Practice Innovations and Legal Solutions Department. And I'm thrilled to be joined by three distinguished panelists, Harriet, who's a Senior Project Manager at CBRE in Legal Operations, Kindra, Practice Director at Paul Hastings and works in the Investment Funds and Private Capital Group. And finally, Nicki, an IT Communications Manager at Perkins Coie. Welcome, Harriet, Kindra, and Nicki. I'd like to ask each of you just to briefly introduce yourself. Maybe start with Harriet, then Kindra, and Nicki.
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here. My name is Harriet Joubert-Vakyles, and as Glenn mentioned, I am in legal operations at CBRE, and I'm really excited to be here today.
I am Kindra Johnson at Paul Hastings. I'm a practice director in the funds group, and I am also happy to be with you all.
I'm Nicki, also glad to be here today. I currently serve as Perkins Coie's IT Communications Manager. I've been doing that for the past 4 years. And yeah, I write, review, and execute our communications, mostly our written ones. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today and have general oversight over our brand, our voice, and our credibility. All important matters.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, let's get started. I'm glad all three of you are happy to be here. I am as well. So let's get started with that first question. So speaking with someone of a different generation often benefits from different approaches. It could be how you communicate, such as email, IM, texting, phone calls, or in person, or what you communicate, your style, such as acronyms, full sentences, or maybe not full sentences, and maybe tone. Have you found any surefire ways when communicating across generations, or alternatively, have you heard of any situations where it's gone awry?
I can kick things off there if you like. Surefire eludes me, but I do have a couple of good examples of lessons learned from some things that have gone awry. In our strategy, when writing communication, we like to use what's called speed bump subject lines. So we want to catch the eye and make sure they're action oriented and all those things. And I thought, I'd like to use the ICYMI in case you missed it type abbreviation in a really broad communication. And it was edited out rather rapidly. And when I reflect on that now, it was really at the early phase or early part of the pandemic. And I think that's important because by and through the pandemic, we were all forced very rapidly into remote work and to near complete virtual engagement, which I think in a sense made those types of things more common, more colloquial. And so I would say, over the years, I've seen more appearances of those types of popular social media style abbreviations, even in, law firm or professional communications of all kinds. And I think that's a really interesting thing to note as exposure and sort of adoption grows. As someone who predominantly writes in this era, there are a couple other interesting generational things I've noted, I'm sure you guys have too, one is the 2 spaces after the end of a period before starting a next one. I feel like this has very clear generational habit on it, and I'm starting to see it less and less. And I personally have worked it out of my pattern, even though it was drilled in me. And I am millennial, I guess, on the early end of the millennials. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I also, I think what's important to note there is that for the modern reader who's attention taxed, that extra space may be a digital disconnect moment, and it could actually take them away from the content and never bring them back. So I have gotten rid of it, and I think there are similar types of things like that happening in written language in our environment as well.
All right. Well, Nicki, thanks. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to share on that front, but yeah, I feel personally torn. I feel like I have two personalities when it comes to the number of spaces after the period. Honestly, I think when I'm writing online social media, I maybe remove a space, but then when I'm writing, say, a formal memo, I put in the 2 spaces. So I think I'm personally very confused on that front. But all right. Well,
I think
let's
it's
go.
actually
Yeah.
cool that you did that, though, that you had like 2 approaches depending on the environment. I mean, that's showcasing exactly what we're talking about here. And so, I don't know, there's just been so many interesting things. And the other part was starting sentences with conjunctions and but. I mean, that was just drilled into me so many and so often back in grammar school, all the way up through college. And now it seems to be highly professionalized. And so I've adapted to that too. I'm trying to. Let's put it that way.
All the power to you, Nicki. Well, speaking of all this, beyond the language differences, my next question is, what cultural shifts do you think have shaped sort of the unique communication styles of your own generation? I suppose I kind of gave away a little bit one of my own shifts, but yeah, the question again is, what cultural shifts have shaped the unique communication styles of your generation, whatever that generation may be?
One, I am a millennial as well. I am considered a geriatric millennial. And I think the main thing that comes to mind here is digital communications. I think when I started, as an adult or coming into my adulthood, the digital landscape was just beginning to take off. And you had things like mobile messaging pop up, workplace instant messaging, Twitter. And I think where we once defaulted across the board, whether we're communicating professionally or writing cards or writing a letter, we kind of defaulted to longer, more formal communication styles. And I think the introduction of those mechanisms that allow for shorter, concise messaging kind of influenced and introduced a casual aspect to communications. And I think Nicki touched on a lot of this, and we see more and more in the workplace, more casual styles, shorter communications, enter emojis where we once didn't need them. We kind of need them now to help round out context and shorter messaging strings. So I would really point to that as one of the key shifts in my culture, in my generational era.
I completely agree. I think there's a lot of use of emojis to add tone because there's, some of the language is stripped out, and
yeah.
But it's interesting because I do in professional environments have encountered people who feel strongly that emojis have no place, and I fully understand that perspective, but it hurts me to not add a smiley face to make sure I'm not mad at you. So yeah, it can be challenging.
Yeah. And I think if people aren't careful about making sure they're choosing the right communication mechanism given the situation, if it requires more rich, complex topics, or you've got to work through something that's particularly difficult, if you're not choosing the right communication mechanism, then I think emojis and different kinds of things to convey your intent and your emotion is absolutely necessary. But I think it's, inherent upon the person who's communicating to really kind of understand what the right avenue and vehicle is.
I never thought about it until just now, but I like to be efficient in the use of my words. And I suddenly realized emojis add to some level, some efficiency, to your communication. So while speaking of content, if emojis consider content, this is what we're going to move to next. So obviously content is key in effective communication. And I think there are some debates about what type of content should be included, particularly if one group considers it inherently unprofessional, while others, they consider it completely normal. So my question is, have any of you experienced this? And I think we already started hearing some of this from Harriet, but have any of you experienced this or seen this in the workplace?
Yeah. So Nicki touched on it at the start of this. The pandemic, I think, really shifted a lot of our communication patterns, not just how we say things, but the types of things that we bring to the workplace. I think pre-pandemic, not even just generationally, there was this is your professional persona and then the rest of your life, and they shall not meet. And then the pandemic kind of threw us all into this environment where we knew a lot more about our colleagues, and I think some of the teams that I saw really make it through the pandemic like cohesively as a team. They really leaned on each other and did share some of those personal things. So I think that's one of the things that are still, I think the pandemic helped a lot with kind of shifting people out of that mindset of we speak strictly about, professional things in the workplace. But I think that there's still some attitudes of, oh, no, we don't talk about these things in the workplace, and we don't need to know about your personal life. And I think for managers, especially, that's been a challenge to kind of navigate, because some of them, they want to manage their people the way that they need to be managed, but there's also an element of, do I need to know all of this? Do I need to have all of this context? So I think that's an interesting kind of wrench in the works.
I know I'm the moderator, but you made me think of something else here, Harriet, which is, I don't know if it's generational or not, but is the idea of transparency. It seems like the idea of transparency has become very common these days. When I think of my earliest bosses, transparency would not be the default mode. Whereas I think in current generations, maybe current culture, there is that comfort with transparency.
And I think part of that too is we now know a lot more about our companies than we ever would have before, right? Because things get published on a daily basis,
Yes.
news gets reported. And so there is also a lot less hiding that you can do. You can tell your people when things are happening, or they can find out about it in the news. And that's going to be a much different experience and not a good one. So I think that adds context to the amount of things that people want to share on a corporate level, and what's going to come out in the wash anyway.
Okay. Well, as all of the audience will know, a lot of content today is consumed via the screen, right? Everybody's watching this presentation via screen. We're not all at a table, right, with all the panelists and me as the moderator. We're dialed in from various locations. So obviously a lot of content these days is consumed via the screen. I wonder if, and maybe not, but I wonder if the content that we provide is consumed differently across generations. Do you see it this way, or maybe do you not see it this way?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I think because so much of our engagements are virtual and our consumption is digital, there is a new and heightened need for sort of an ethical lens on the way we engage online. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is empathy, because everyone is suffering to some degree of information overload. And I was hoping and really interested to find if there were any research that specifically covered the way members of different generations, going back to the silent generation up through Gen Alpha, process information, or if they have a higher tolerance or style or approach, how much they disconnect and stay in tune, those types of things. And while I did not uncover that particular stone, I did come across an interesting piece of research from the Institute of Public Relations that a colleague had passed my way. And, it surveyed, I think, 1,100 people cross-organizationally, cross-generationally, that span all of those key generations still in our workforce, so not Generation Alpha yet. And it showed that, when they picked the communication style and mode mechanism they prefer, it's still email, which I think it was like 72% in findings in this particular piece of research. And that tracks. I think that makes sense, although it does raise questions. And the other second, I think, most popular, most comfortable, most preferred was staff meetings. And I think a number of those things are held hybrid these days. So you have some people online, some people in the room, and that's creating familiarity and comfort and interest across the generations. So I think those were two remarkable highlights. I think from a law firm perspective, and I'm sure everyone here can chime in on this, you know, lawyers work in their email. That's predominantly where their work happens. And so I think they commonly give us sort of a two-sided answer. They feel inundated by email and are tired of it and they're ignoring it, or, you know, filing it away and hoping to come back to it. But also then telling us, like, I have to be contacted by email. That's where I am all day. And I think that's really interesting. So one other thing I have noticed, at least in the technology communication realm that I'm in, is that we've gotten a lot of feedback from attorneys that sometimes overly graphic or HTML, almost vendor-looking type emails actually do the opposite of attracting them. It actually kind of repels them in a way because it doesn't look like client work. So there's a lot of interesting things here to think about as we continue to scope how to stay connected with people.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. So there's a book that was published in 2010 called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. And in that book, he talks about how when we read words on a page, we read kind of, you know, how you think of reading. And when we read words on a screen, we read it in an F pattern. So we read the top line-ish, and then we kind of scan down, and then we read a middle section, and then we scan down. So we're not reading in the same way. But I think that's interesting too, because this was published in 2010. So I don't know exactly when the research was done, but I would be fascinated to know what that looks like now. So the internet has changed our brains and how we read, but for the generations that have existed alongside the internet their entire lives, you know, what does that look like? And what does communication with them and to them look like? And how would that need to shift? So I think that's fascinating. And I mean, even in the context of, you talk to people about paper books versus Kindles, and some people are very pro one or the other. And I think that doesn't necessarily break down generationally. I think it's a processing preference. So
great observation there. Yep.
Yeah. A quick personal anecdote on that. That adds a lot of color, Harriet, because when I really want to understand something, I want to read it. I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to watch it. I want to kind of almost be tempted to print and read. So that's kind of fascinating, what you just mentioned.
Absolutely agree, Kindra. And when I do the same thing, I really need to dig in. I have to print it.
Yeah.
Or hold it. I don't know. It's just interesting.
Some listeners are like, what is print?
Right.
How do you do that?
Huh? Print what?
Print just means print to PDF, right?
Oh, I exactly, which is still a digital format. I had my daughter ask me the other night, I was watching Seinfeld, and he's on the phone, and she goes, "What is he holding?" It's an old phone. Just a cordless phone from the 90s. Like, you have no idea.
Wow.
Well, that was definitely interesting. I have my own thoughts, but I know we're running close on time. And so I want to give each of you a few moments to just share with the audience any tips or takeaways, anything from this conversation or prior to this conversation that you'd like to share with everyone. And I think maybe Kindra might kick us off with that.
Yeah, I'll share some techniques that I personally employ. I don't make assumptions. When I'm talking to someone, I will mirror their communication style to ensure that what I want to convey actually lands with them, because that's the most important thing to get your message across. So I use a mirroring technique a lot. And when I'm unsure, I just default to clear, full sentences. Just make sure I'm trying to get the entire thought out in a clear, comprehensive way.
I love that, Kindra. I agree with you. Don't make assumptions, right? And it's especially tempting, I think, to look at generations and find the differences, but really the commonality is what's key when we communicate. I mean, it's no accident that, you know, community and communicate start with the same Latin root, which is the bringing people together. And I think that really makes sense. You're meeting them where they are. And I think of the same tactic when I'm writing for the modern reader, meeting them where they are. And so I also encourage people, you know, all of us to be bold, try something. If it gets red penned, okay, you know, but you never know, there may be an appetite for it at some point. And sometimes you really just don't know until you go.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I implore everyone to do is to stay curious about what the different types of communication are, because I think at some point we kind of get this, like, we know there are letters, there are emails, there are PDFs that we can send. But there is a whole world out there of, you know, TikTok things being created, reels, you know, graphics, all kinds of things. And I think as long as we don't get stuck on one way of trying to communicate at this point, Kindra, I love what you said. Yes, mirroring. And if it's not working, recognizing that it's not working, because I think that's sometimes the thing that, you know, I personally hate calling people on the phone, but I will call people if I've noticed this person's not responding to my emails, but if I call them, they will pick up and answer and I will get an answer out of them. So just recognizing when things are not working and adjusting course.
And I'll quickly add to that, just closing the communication loop, in that you are confirming that the other person received the message that you intended. So asking that in whatever form you need to these days, but making sure you get that confirmation back that, okay, we've effectively communicated.
All right. Well, this was a very fun conversation. I feel like this has resulted in lots of other topics we can talk about down the road. I really enjoy the time that I spent with the three of you today and even before in our virtual communications via email. So it was great to have a normal conversation in person in front of lots of people. So thank you very much for your time and all the expertise that you shared with us today. And we, of course, hope that the audience that will soon view this will enjoy it. So with that, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day wherever you are. Bye.
You.
Thank you.
Thanks all.